that be hard for me?
I mean, you can. You know, it's up to you.
Pastor, will I get in trouble if I do this? All right. Yeah, tell me. No, I'm going to stand here. I'm going to put the laptop there. Is that okay? All right.
There you go. Give the camera
I don't know. I'm probably going to throw them off. Is it okay, guys? I don't want to. I can't go up if you want me to. It's okay? I'm waiting for the pastor to give me a thumbs up. 2 thumbs up. Oh, man. Yeah. You know, Matthew Lucio, since your pastor is friends with another pastor friend of mine, he has an honorary seat in his church for Ellen White, reserved for Ellen White. It's really funny. It's a little cutout of Ellen White. He has a very unusual sense of humor for... I know, they're hilarious. Yeah. Where does he come up with all those ideas? I don't know. All right. It's been great to be here with you guys. This is always where you find out who the true remnant is. After lunch, on Sabbath afternoon. And I know favorite place is the Springs, to visit the Springs. So I feel privileged that you hang out with me here this afternoon. Hold on, just making sure I'm getting everything working. Oh, wait, we have to plug this in. One more. I'm sorry. I'm just messing everything up. Here we go. I've been a teacher long enough that I kind of like getting closer to you guys. Some of you sit in the back. Okay. Feel free to come up a little closer. And what's fun is this afternoon, thank you, sir, is if you have some questions, we'll have a little time for Q&A at the end. But as we go through this, if you want to, don't be bashful, and we'll go through this together. Oh, that is up on the screen already. Just a minute, folks. Here we go.
It's 1922, a new book?
Well, depends how you define new book. I have a new book coming out in April. That's my new book. But this 1922 came out last year, so it's just a little less than a year old. And part of what I'm going to present this afternoon is in 1922 and is in another book that will be coming out very soon. I'll tell you about it in just a second. So, all right, I think, what's that?
Somehow I missed that. 1922.
You missed it? Well, I got good news for you. I brought a few copies.
Great.
At least I brought 22 of 22. Actually, I had 2 more in my satchel, so it's 24. But I have 24, and I have 2 copies of 1919. There's my other book, and I have a couple copies of my Ellen White Pocket Dictionary. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I think so. I think I...
Yeah. So I brought a few of those, so I'll tell you about them here in just a minute. Should I just tell you a fun story before we get started? This has no spiritual value at all. I'm just going to tell you a story just because I can. But when I was a young pastor long ago and far away, I wanted to be a good pastor. And the first summer that I was there, I had an intern. I was very excited, a theology major, and he worked hard. And so the end of the summer, we were near the mountains, kind of like here, And so what do you do for fun? In the summertime at the mountains, you go jeeping. So my church elders had said, Pastor, don't rent a Jeep, call us and you can borrow one of ours. And I said, So I called one of my elders up. I said, hey, can I borrow your Jeep? Oh, Pastor, so glad you asked. And he said, when would you like it? I said, when's most convenient? So we agreed on the end of the week. And He said, very easy. It's a black Jeep, soft top. I'll leave the keys in the car. It's just south of town off the highway. I'll park it there. You can't miss it. So I get my theology major intern. We get together, and we head south of town. We found a black Jeep, soft top, keys in the car, just like he said, and we had the most glorious day Jeeping. We went way up in the mountains. We climbed a 14er together. We just had a great day. And then I came back, I parked it where I found it, and I called my elder and I said, thank you so much. We had such a delightful time. And he said, Pastor, I don't know whose Jeep you had, but I can tell you it wasn't mine. So I said, hey, you were one of my elders. And they said that, we would need to turn to our elders for advice. I said, I'm asking you for advice. He said, I can't tell you what you should do, but if it were me, I'd get out of there as quick as I could. So we had something going on at our house later, and pretty soon everybody knew what their young, silly pastor had done. And next day I get an email from one of my church members. And the gist of the email is, Pastor, you have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Repent and turn yourself in. And I said, there's a time I couldn't have told you this story. I was a little shaken up by that. I called my head elder, who was a retired pastor. He said, come on over to the house. I went and cried on his shoulder. He said, well, I've got a question for you. I said, sure. He said, if this were your Jeep and someone took it, how would you feel? And I said, well, as long as they returned it in the same condition, as an honest mistake, I wouldn't care. Okay? And so, so I said, what do I do about the church member? He said, well, Pastor, if I've learned anything in all my years of working for the church, don't let someone else be conscience for you. Okay. So next day comes, and I'm out visiting church members and stuff and what have you, and I get a phone call. It's from the sheriff. Pastor, we need you to come down and talk to us about a Jeep. I said, sure. So he met me. My wife called, said, sweetheart, come home and give me a kiss before you go to jail. So I met with the head sheriff, and he said, tell me the whole story. Don't leave out any details. Tell me everything. And I said, so I told him the whole thing, and about halfway through I saw a grin on his face, and I kind of figured I was going to be okay at that point. And he got done listening to me. He said, well, next time we have a stolen car in town, we're going to just check all the pastors. And he said, you want to know whose Jeep you took? I said, yeah, I wish I'd left to know. He said, well, it's the town drunk. He's always losing his Jeep. But he called us and said it was missing, and then he called us later and said it's right where I found it, except for it was on empty, but now the gas tank's full. And I did kind of wonder who loans out their car on empty, but I filled it up, and then I filled it up again, because my parents always told me, take better care of other people's stuff than your own, right? And so I did that, and so I learned, I learned the importance of mentoring, I suppose. That might be a lesson from that. I learned not to take Jeeps. That's the other lesson from that. But it did occur to me that, what do you do when the town drunk was more reasonable than some of my own church members?
Hello.
Yeah, so the way we treat people, the way we treat one another as fellow church members, it matters. It makes a difference. By the way, I made friends with that guy, that Jeep. He went and worked out at the same place that I did, and eventually he actually offered it, asked me if I wanted to buy it. I said, no, I'm okay. I'm okay. But we became friends, and I actually invited him to church. We developed a friendship, and all out of accidentally taking someone's Jeep. Yeah, so now that I got that confession out of the way. Should we talk about some real Adventist history? There's not much. That's just a fun story. Anyways, I guess we all have our foibles and flaws and make mistakes and live and learn. Let's pray together, and let's talk about the promise and peril of fundamentalism. We've got some heady stuff here this afternoon, so hopefully the Let's dive right in. Let's pray. Father God, thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to be here, to learn, to grow, to reflect about our Adventist history. We've talked about a lot of stories that about how you have providentially led, and we know that there's certainly those high points, but there's also been areas of tension and struggle and challenge. How to properly interpret Ellen White and those kinds of things. Help us as we seek to better understand those things in the light of our past in ways that will help us to keep our eyes centered on you and to uphold Scripture in a way that would lead us closer to you, is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, this would be my one and only plug for my books, and so it's hard for me because it's Sabbath, and I try to find the right balance of what things to do. But I come all this way, and then some people want and say, "Hey, I want to go deeper with what you share." And so after the presentation this afternoon, there will be some books out on the table, and a sign-up sheet, right? So if you're going to get one of them, and then there you go. So however you want to do that, but she's your lady right there, and thank you. And but we'll have, I think I've got 22 or 24 copies of 22, and I have 2 copies of 1919. I'm sorry, that's all I have. And so if you're interested and want to dive deeper, you're like, I really, really like Adventist history. Those are materials that I've worked on, and I'm proud of. I've worked hard at those, and represents a lot of work, and so I'm excited that those are available. Yeah.
Thinking about fundamentalism, do you have the 1927 book of the debate between Nichols and the guy that was the evolutionist?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. And our good friend Matthew Lucio has a whole episode. So any of you like podcasts and listening to Adventist history, this will be my other unashamed self-promotion, I'm sorry. But Adventist History Podcast is where it's at. He does a really great job of telling Adventist history. And what Matthew and I have done together is develop what we're calling the Adventist History Podcast Network. So kind of like a family of podcasts. Some of you are like, what's a podcast? Well, you get it on your phone, right? And you can listen to episodes. They're free.
Matthew who?
Matthew Lucio. But the name of the podcast is the Adventist History Podcast. And I have a companion podcast that I do with Greg Howell called Adventist Pilgrimage. So you can check that out. And we do like a deep dive on an issue or topic in Adventist history. And then I managed to talk one of my dear friends, one of my religion profs at Southern, Judd Lake, and he's now doing the Ellen White podcast. So we got 3 of these podcasts, all dealing with Ellen White, Adventist history, all of this kind of stuff. And we're all kind of part of, I guess, like an informal network where we're trying to support each other and research about Adventist history and stuff like that. So if you like that kind of thing, there's some more stuff that you can do a deep dive on. Matthew's getting up to the 20th century, and I'm doing a series that there's some people that have attacked Ellen White in the church, and so we're doing a 4-part series providing resources to people, to some of these antagonistic websites and an antagonistic podcast that's attacking the church. And so what we're doing in Adventist Pilgrimage is, here's the resources, here's responses, here's historical explanations for these things that they're attacking the church with. So, because as a pastor, I've been a pastor for a number of years, I have a pastoral heart, and in that I want people to know how to find good answers to questions that they might have. Okay, so and I have my new book is We Stand on Their Shoulders, which is the stories of early Adventist pastors, coming out in April from Pacific Press. So. There we go. All right, let's dive in. Adventism and fundamentalism. Those of you that came last night, we talked a little bit about it, but just kind of a little bit of review. And I'm going to be kicking off with the 1922 General Conference, so kind of give you a little teaser of some of the things that I learned from that. But fundamentalism, and what I'm talking about this afternoon, some people always ask me, fundamentalism, that doesn't sound like a very nice word. We have Islamic fundamentalist terrorists. Are you calling someone a terrorist if you call them a fundamentalist? And no, that is not what I'm doing. That is not what I'm doing at all. There's a lot of different ways that people use terms, and they change over time. But I'm a historian, and my specialty is the early 20th century. And so this was a historical movement that gave rise, thanks to these pamphlets, which we talked about last night, conservative Christians who became militant in defending the faith over a variety of issues. But in defending the faith from these modernists or liberals, they started going to the other extreme and trying to. And so first thing I'm going to tell you is that there's good and bad things to both the modernist and the fundamentalist movements. Both sides had strengths as well as weaknesses. All right, so when I say this afternoon, I'm talking about the promise and the peril fundamentalism. Mostly I'm going to talk about fundamentalism because very rarely in Adventist history have we dealt with or had people that said, oh, I'm a modernist, I love modernism, I want to be a liberal. That's not the temptation that Adventists generally face. Our temptation as a church, historically speaking, is our challenge, our biggest challenge tends to be fundamentalism. Even the most liberal Christians, liberal Adventists I know, when I go to professional scholarly meetings, like the American Academy of Religion, I'm throwing these names out, but when I go there, I take our most liberal theologians in the Adventist church, and they look like fundamentalists to the true liberals that I meet that are at these hardcore meetings and stuff like that. So we have a spectrum within Adventism theologically, right? But that spectrum is in the big, wider world of ideas and theology is actually really quite conservative. So, and I have a picture up there. There's the 1922 General Conference session. It took place in San Francisco, outside of Battle Creek. More General Conference sessions were held in San Francisco or Oakland than any other town in all of Adventist history. It was a popular place. It was a great convention center that was there. It still stands. I was visiting there this last summer, and I like to find Adventist heritage sites. So my family humored me. Well, they got to see things that they wanted to see. We found the main convention center across from City Hall in San Francisco. That's where the 1922 General Conference session occurred. We'll talk about what that meant for Adventism and fundamentalism. But what is fundamentalism? Last night I talked about George Marsden, probably the leading scholar of the 20th century of fundamentalism, trying to understand its history, its culture, its origins. He's actually come out with a new edition of that book, Fundamentalism in American Culture, considered the benchmark classic in the field. So if you really want to get into fundamentalist scholarship, I took a PhD seminar from him at Notre Dame, and there was about a dozen of us doctoral students, and he said, I need you to help me update the bibliography of all the scholarship in the last 10 years since the last time I checked. And our bibliography was over 100 pages long of scholarly articles. So the fundamentalist scholarship and stuff like that has really blossomed in the last 2 decades. And we ask, what is fundamentalism? Well, I've tried to paint a picture, but it's this reaction to modernism. It's this tends to be millennial in nature, apocalyptic, focused on end-time events. And you have a reaffirmation of the validity of Scripture, of miracles, the atonement of Christ. And I think most of us would probably agree with most of what fundamentalism has to say in terms of those are kinds of, I'm here testifying before you. I'm an ordained minister of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I believe the Bible is true. And I hope you'd say amen with me, right? And that the miracles portrayed in the Bible, those are legitimate, When Jesus says that he ascended and was resurrected, that he is a living Savior. I believe these things are true. And so I believe the Bible is reliable. Now, the problem with fundamentalism comes that there were some people who began to go and push even farther than just saying the Bible's true, to actually say that the Bible is inerrant and infallible, that there can be no mistakes. And some Adventists who began to use Ellen White as a prism as the only way through which to interpret the Bible. And that's when we began to run into trouble. So which raises the question, when Bill Johnson, who's a friend of mine, I've done oral history with him and interviewed him, former editor of the Review for many years, and he wrote an editorial asking in 1982, are Seventh-day Adventist fundamentalists? Now, that's over 40 years ago. And Bill Johnson said, the answer is no. Well, remember last night I asked you that question in 1922 and 1919? They would have said the answer was Yes, because in the intervening time from 1919 to 1982, a lot of our church leaders realized that fundamentalism had some very problematic aspects to it. And so he's asking that question. I've already showed you a picture of this, the fundamentals, these booklets, a lot of fun. And we get to the actual 1922 General Conference session, because you have 1919, and just in kind of in a nutshell to paint this for you, 1919 Bible Conference is wrestling with Ellen White, and a lot of the church leaders said inerrancy and infallibility with Ellen White, it just doesn't work. Ellen White revised her books, revised historical sources, all of those kinds of things. Great Controversy went through many different editions. I went to a church gathering a few years back, and I walked into the door, and they said, "Oh, here's an 1888 edition of the Great Controversy. It's the earlier and purer edition of Great Controversy versus the later 1911 edition." And I looked at them and I said, "Yeah, that's not the first edition." They said, "Oh, yes, it is." I said, "No, I actually," being the collector that I am, see, you're shaking your head. You know this too. The first edition of the Great Controversy was
The Spirit of Prophecy volumes, and then before that, early writings.
Spiritual Gifts,
Yes.
Volume 1, which was published in,
Was the original, I think.
my star student here, fellow bibliophile, historian, what year was it published?
Which?
Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1.
1862?
No, earlier.
Before that?
Yeah. So she had her Great Controversy vision March 14, 1858. The first edition of Great Controversy, let it be known to you here today in Northern Idaho, was in 1858. That was the very earliest edition. I looked at them, they looked at me, and they said, "Are you No, you're wrong." I said, "No, go check it out for yourself." 1858. Well, this was a major topic of debate at the 1919 Bible Conference. How did she revise her writings? They said, "Well, we worked with Ellen White. We know Ellen White." And there were people like Claude Holmes and J.S. Washburn, whose pictures I showed last night, who were attacking church leaders and said, "You're not faithful in understanding the spirit of prophecy. You're undermining the prophetic gift because you don't believe her writings are inerrant and infallible." And 1922, at that General Conference session, finally, it's so heated. It's so, I would even say, toxic, okay, that people are taking sides back and forth. You actually have the General Conference session. People are lining up, and after the first week, they still haven't decided on General Conference president, which is the first business item of a General Conference session. And they're going through a whole week, and they basically haven't done anything. They're just fighting over who's going to be the next church president. And eventually, they decide to do a compromise, and they swap. They take the secretary of the General Conference, the number 2 position, W.A. Spicer, who's pictured up there, and they make him General Conference president, and A.G. Daniels, who's General Conference president, becomes secretary. So it's basically a flip-flop of roles, and that way there's no side really wins or loses at 1922. And you have to remember that 1922 comes just after World War I, which was very militarized a lot of the Christian church as they are trying to defend themselves. Someone asked me and said, "Well, weren't some people upset, like the conservatives? Were they upset that the government was coming and having to censor publications and telling people to kind of lay off a little bit?" And I said, "Well, absolutely not, because nobody was complaining, because if you did not comply, you were seen as unpatriotic." And so this becomes the great era of the challenge, the issue of Christian nationalism, right? You have to prove your patriotism. So churches put flags up front, things like that. Even in the General Conference session itself, can you see the American flags there? Yeah, up until then, every General Conference session you would have never seen flags, American flags in churches. Not that people didn't believe in supporting their country, it's just that this whole notion of the separation of church and state was so vividly impressed within the Adventist psyche that no one would have ever imagined putting flags of countries inside of a sanctuary of a church. But that all began to change. Here's another picture I've actually found. Again, here's the podium. You see American flags, banners in the background behind it, and the picture is a little bit deceptive. It doesn't really convey some of the angst and the tension that is there. And you have to remember, this is the aftermath of what's happened in 1919, the aftermath of the struggle for Adventist identity, and how will we understand and interpret Ellen White and her writings. I might just digress for just a minute because I think I should, and that is that I've spent a lot of time talking about Ellen White this morning as a person, who she was, and I've had several of you come up and talk to me, and I didn't have a chance to just put this into my presentation this afternoon, but it's probably worth just taking a moment. How do we actually interpret Ellen White's writings in a healthy and balanced way? How do we do that? I'm going to give you 5 steps. I didn't invent this. I actually got it from Roger Kuhn. Roger Kuhn got it from Arthur White. Actually, George Knight has this in his books, if you've read any of George Knight's books too, okay? I'm going to give you 5 easy steps. So you heard it today, and you're like, oh, okay, I can see it. Okay, so you're ready for this? 5 easy steps. Campbell, this will be soup notes or cliff notes. Yeah, is that okay? Yeah. All right, ready? Number 1, always preparation. Heart preparation through prayer and a sense of humility and asking God to make you teachable. Anytime you approach inspired writings, whether Ellen White or the Bible, you should always come prepared. Prepared with an open heart and open mind. Too often we go to inspired writings to have the Bible tell us, or we tell the Bible what we want it to tell us, rather than actually saying, God, make me teachable, help me to really hear and understand what it is that I'm going through in my life right now, that I can use in my life. Does that make sense? Yeah, preparation. And we're all on a journey. We're all learning and growing. Even this Adventist historian, I've had some challenges in my life, and I've had to say, God, why did this happen? And have to really wrestle with and say, God, I need you to help me. So preparation. Second step. Okay, so if you're just taking notes, number 1 is preparation. Number 2, all available data. All available data. In other words, when you're searching inspired writings, for example, Ellen White, you can't just take one particular quote and then start hammering people over the head with it. You need to look at a particular topic and try to figure out, does she have any other qualifying statements? And by the way, there are some topics that she doesn't write anything about at all. Right? So you need to not just pick and choose. You have to look at all of what is there. Number 3 is context. Historical context, literary context. I'll use an example. Somebody asked me, and I don't remember who now, because I've had just a delightful time talking to many of you. Someone asked me about life insurance. I don't remember who it was, but life insurance. Hopefully they're here. But should we get life insurance? Ellen White makes, I think it's 1 or 2 statements where she talks about life insurance, and basically she says you shouldn't get it. Well, does that mean you shouldn't ever get life insurance? Well, you have to look at the context of the statement. What was going on when she made that statement? And I think it was in the 1870s or so, when there were a few life insurance people that would travel around, and they were basically scam artists. So if you gave them money, it was more of a Ponzi scheme, and you were pretty sure that you would never actually realize any benefit for, and this is before life insurance, the whole life insurance industry was regulated. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether you should get life insurance or not, but I don't think you can fairly use those 1 or 2 statements to argue that you should not have life insurance. In fact, the Seventh-day Adventist Church today, if you're a church employee, you will have automatically a certain amount of life insurance, because God forbid something terrible happens, then your family will be taken care of. And I can rest with certainty and know that if something terrible happens between here and Maryland tomorrow while I'm traveling home, God forbid, then I know my family will be taken care of. That the life insurance, I don't have to wonder, will they actually get any money, that my kids would be fine, and there would be, not that any of us want that, but you get what I'm trying to say, right? And so historical context. And there's lots of examples of this. There's lots of examples. The most famous example usually is every girl should learn how to hitch a horse. Ellen White says that. Ladies, do you all know how to hitch a horse? you are living in violation of the spirit of prophecy. Or maybe she's talking about how to do basic transportation maintenance. Today we'd say maybe a young woman should know how to change a tire. I don't know. Change the oil, something like that, right? That kind of, hopefully that makes sense. How many of you have cell phones that have cameras in them? Raise your hands. I want to see. You all are sinners in violation of the spirit of prophecy. Because Ellen White, there's only one published confession I've ever found of Ellen White, and it's for the sin of photography.
What?
Yeah. Did you know that?
No.
Well, we can do one of two things. Either of you all pass in your cell phones in the offering tray, because you have cameras on them, or maybe we should find out a little bit of historical context. Well, what was going on? Well, at that time when photography was new, it was very expensive. And the tradition was that on a Friday night or a Sabbath afternoon, you'd go calling on other homes, and you'd have what was called a carte de visite, a small little photograph like about this size. It came over from the French. And you'd have a card, and you might have a card, and we would trade cards. And by the way, I mentioned this morning in my Sabbath school talk about the descendant who had all these photographs. What she had was a photograph album full of carte de visites. These were almost trading cards, right? And so if you had a special friend, you would trade carte de visites. And Ellen White sat down and had carte de visites made, these photographs, very expensive. She didn't pay for them, she just sat for them. And apparently, guess who was the most hotly traded carte de visite in the 1870s? Well, Ellen White's was. Everyone wanted one, and James White. And so she felt so bad because right at that same time, guess what the church was doing? We were trying to raise money to send our first official missionary, J. and Andrews. And if you know the story of J. and Andrews going over to Europe, church didn't have very much money. They sent what they could. He used his life savings as well, and we'd used up all of his money and the money that the church had sent with him. At one point, he was almost starving to death. Our first missionary. Now, this is not the happy side of the story that we usually tell, but Ellen White knew that our mission, our first missionary and his family, was starving while we're spending money on fancy photographs and trading them. And she felt so bad that she contributed to distracting the church from its mission, literally, that she published a confession on the back page of the review for the sin of photography. Now, was she saying that all times and all places that we should never have pictures taken? Well, I think not, because later on, photography becomes much, much cheaper, and she actually sits and has her picture taken many times subsequently. In fact, one person will actually come and say, "It's a sin to have a picture ever taken," and she says, "Dear brother, you are deluded." She didn't mince her words, rebuking some what she called one-idea men, or what we might use the term fanatic. That was her preferred term. And so needless to say, historical context matters. So I think it's okay. You can keep your cell phone and feel you can be okay about it. But historical context, literary context, sometimes you can read something, if you take one little snippet, but if you actually read the surrounding context, the paragraph, the page, the chapter, you can actually see that she doesn't actually say what a lot of people make her out to actually say. And so reading the context, historical context, the literary context makes all the difference. So what do we have? Let's see. We've got number one, preparation. Number two, all available data. Number three, context. Number four, principles versus their application. So you have to be able to tell what's the actual principle, which tends to be timeless. I can think of 10 of them. 10 commandments, right? Those are 10 timeless principles, Ellen White would say, versus application to specific circumstances. We see application most often with things with lifestyle kinds of topics, music, health reform, dress reform. Well, she'll apply certain counsels in different ways depending on the situation. And I think where a lot of people struggle the most, especially with health reform, is they want to take one set of counsels and apply it to everybody at all times in every place. And it doesn't always work like that. And for example, eggs. Ellen White will write, you shouldn't touch eggs, don't eat eggs, things like that. And then another place, she had somebody that was having malnutrition, not getting enough nourishment. His name was David Paulson. She rebuked him for being a health deformer. By the way, if you want a fun word study in Ellen White's writings, check out health deformer. Anyway, maybe I shouldn't do that to you. That I don't want you to get distracted here this afternoon. But it makes for some very interesting reading. And so she rebuked him. He is a health deformer, taking every Ellen White counsel on health reform and taking it to extremes. And she said, dear brother, it'd be better for you to have a raw egg and grape juice every day. So she prescribed that for him, and he actually did get better. He started getting more nourishment, nutrition that his body needed. And one time I asked at a camp meeting, I said, how many of you follow Ellen White perfectly, and there was a couple of people that really said, how many of you have a raw egg and grape juice every day? And one man in the back raised his hand. I thought, I'm not going to ask that anybody raise their hand anymore. That's a little bit scary. But I think you get the idea that we have to know what a principle is and how to apply it to a specific circumstance. And it might look very different depending on the application of the principle. Does that make sense? And then last but not least, so let's see, we have number 1, preparation. Number 2, all available data. Number 3, context. Number 4, principles versus application. Number 5, and this is the last one. We're going to move on with our presentation today. But I just felt maybe I should just go over this very quickly in a nutshell, because I think it's so important how we interpret Ellen White in a healthy and balanced way. But number 5 is know how to find and ask for help. Good resources, good information. The church has gone to great lengths to provide excellent resources to help people find information. And that goes from the Ellen White webpage, the Ellen White Estate webpage, ellenwhite.org. Very easy. You can get all of her writings published and unpublished. There's nothing hidden anymore. Trust me, they gave me a key at the White Estate. Said, go have, basically, when I was an intern, I got to go anywhere and everywhere. I even checked under the stairs. There's just nothing hidden. It's all digitized. Even all the letters written to Ellen White have been digitized. The document file, millions of pages. For a researcher, from a researcher's standpoint, this is a bonanza, because you can just find anything you possibly could ever dream and want. It's been digitized. It's been scanned. It's available for researchers to look up and to go through. So the Ellen White Estate webpage has all of this stuff. Amazing. And there's other tools. One of them that I'm proud of, because I spent over 10 years of my life working on with Jerry Moon and Denis Fortin. I was a grad student at the time. They actually made me the assistant editor, their assistant, which was very generous of them. And that was the Ellen White Encyclopedia. The Ellen White Encyclopedia. And that's available on Kindle. And for anyone that really wants to seriously look into Ellen White, that's your benchmark reference work. And you get that from the ABC. You can get it on Kindle. There's a lot of different ways that you can get that. Now the price is only about half of what it used to be when it first came out. So it's not, it's expensive, but it's not that expensive. You know what I mean? And several people asked me over lunch and elsewhere today, what about Ellen White and the shut door, I think it was, right? And some of these, there's a couple of other topics, right, that people wanted to know about. Guess what? Over 200 scholars contributed. I don't remember how many thousands of articles it is that's in the encyclopedia, but pretty much there's some kind of really good reference work. It's been peer reviewed, and at the end of every article, it'll tell you both who wrote it and then a section for further reading. So if you want to know more, here's the key sources that you need to consult that you can do that. So one last time, we'll see if we get it. It'll be all or none, right? All right? So I can't leave you here today without these 5 steps. Preparation, yeah, I heard you. Number 2,
Data.
all available data. Number 3,
Context.
Number 4,
Apply the principles.
principles versus application. And last but not least, know how to get specialized help. And that's why we have scholars in the church, that if you have challenges and problems, don't be afraid to reach out. We have the Ellen G. White Estate. I function in a capacity as a historian, I guess as the historian for the Adventist Church in North America. That's kind of my role. And if I don't have an answer for you, I know how to find people that do know the answer, because I can help point you in the right direction at least, okay? All right. Now that we've had that lovely, lovely detour, let's get back to 1922 and the promise and peril of fundamentalism. The 1922 General Conference session was notable because of all of the international representation. Our church has become a global church, and in the mid-1920s, right about this time, there begins to be more members outside of North America than there are inside North America. Our church is changing as it truly becomes a global church. And here's another couple pictures. Those are the stenographers that write down all the transcripts, and we have, thanks to their hard work, transcripts of the General Conference session, and there's the venue. Now I'm going to go to the peril of fundamentalism, because I've spent some time talking about how to interpret Ellen White, and there are some positive aspects, but I would say probably the biggest challenge that pertains to fundamentalism in Seventh-day Adventism is that in the 1920s, some of these fundamentalist ideas, the extreme versions of it, proof texting and using Ellen White in an errant and a literalistic and infallible kind of way, created an atmosphere where some of the fundamentalists began teaching an idea of perfectionism and how we are saved that also began to be adopted within Adventism. Today we call those ideas last generation theology. Back in the 1920s, they had other terms for that. In fact, I just got, there's a copy of a book by Matilda Erickson that I'm going to show here in my presentation that would probably be the most lasting and most troubling and challenging aspect for Adventism in conjunction with fundamentalism. And so I want to present to you a little bit about the challenge of last generation theology that dates back to the 1920s and this whole notion of fundamentalism. But what is last generation theology? Well, it's this idea, and most people attribute it to M.L. Andreasen, but I actually can now show historically it goes back to the 1920s. And if you haven't picked up on this by now, I did 1919, 1922, and right now I'm in the midst of writing what's going to be called 1925. And unless you think I'm just going to go every 3 years, I'm stopping there. I'm just telling you right now, I'm stopping there. 1925 is going to be looking at what I'm presenting to you this afternoon, which is what I consider the peril of fundamentalism, is the historical origins of last generation theology. Some people have noted that this idea goes back to M.L. Andreasen, others to A.G. Jones and Wagner, although you can see some of those ideas initially. But it's this idea that God's character has to be perfectly reproduced in his people in order for Christ to come. Or, to put it another way, we have to be perfect in order for the second advent to happen. Now, this is not an idea that's unique to Adventism. You can go back to the first century Jews, and they believed that if all of Israel could keep the Sabbath, Shabbat, perfectly 2 Sabbaths in a row, that then they could bring the Messiah to come. So we're certainly not unique. There's a certain element of human nature where we can make theology about ourselves.
Another form of works.
Yeah.
Righteousness by works, right? Or legalism. By the way, just a disclaimer really quick. I do believe in last generation theology, because there will be a last generation and Jesus will come. But it's not because I'm perfect, but it's because Christ is perfect and I'm perfectly surrendered to him. And I trust him for his perfection to cover me. This has been a hot topic of debate in Adventism, because some people think you do have to be perfect. And I've met people who've very frankly and clearly told me, if we could just get all of Adventists to follow the health message perfectly, follow the dress reform message perfectly, and do everything the way that I think they should, then Jesus will come. And so here's a couple of books. George Knight, Reindeer Bruinsma. This came out, God's Character in the Last Generation, probably the most extensive book. That was edited by Yerji Muscala, Dean of the Seminary, Andrews, and John Peckham, systematic theology professor. And there's a lot of people that have tried to challenge and rehabilitate these ideas, even quite recently. For the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead. Some people can see some of these ideas very early on with Wagner. Paul Evans, who is just ahead of me at Andrews in the doctoral program, wrote a dissertation on this where he looked at M.L. Andreasen and his theology. And certainly in the 1930s and 40s, M.L. Andreasen was the leading theologian of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And he clearly taught last generation theology. And I have some citations and examples. Here's one from his book, The Sanctuary Service, published in 1947. He argued that the final demonstration of what the gospel can do in and for humanity is still in the future. The world is awaiting this demonstration that the Bible inculcates holiness is indisputable. And he'll go on in some detail, but basically the idea that God's people have to be perfect in order for Christ to come. And so where did those ideas come from? Well, I'm going to argue this afternoon in the time that I have here to be that a lot of these ideas come from fundamentalism. They come from a branch of the fundamentalist movement most clearly associated with what we call as holiness Adventist, or holiness, the holiness doctrines or teachings, which come from a couple of different places. They come from John Wesley, Wesleyan roots, Methodism, right? Oberlin perfectionism, Keswick teachings from England, and Dwight L. Moody, if you've ever heard of Dwight Moody and his empire. And I'm going to go over this pretty quickly, and I'm going to try to apply it to Adventism here. And don't be afraid, we'll come back and circle back and show how this kind of all fits together, okay? But the Wesleyan roots, John Wesley was very passionate about teaching about holiness and perfection. You'll notice that Ellen White writes a lot about holiness and perfection. And if you look at the language she uses, such in the book Steps to Christ, the language and terminology that she uses is the same as Wesley. And this should come as no surprise to us because she grew up in a Methodist home. And so her way of viewing perfection is very similar to that of Wesley. And I'm going to say this. I'm going to say it in a provocative way to kind of make you think, but don't go crazy here on me and say Dr. Campbell. But there's many Adventists that are really good Catholics.
Oops.
Yeah, that's my mic drop right there for you. Okay, that's my mic drop. And yeah, there's a lot of Adventists that are very good Catholics in terms of how they view perfection, because they see perfection as a list of outward things that one does or doesn't do. And well, I might as well just go all the way here. Okay. You got me rolling here. All right. So what do Catholics like to do? Confession and penance, right? Confession and penance. So I was with a group of Adventist religion scholars, and we were in Rome. We're having a big Bible conference, and we had one day that we could do anything we wanted. And I said, oh, this is so cool. What's a church historian going to do when you have a whole day in Rome? So guess what I did? I decided I'd see if I could earn myself an indulgence. Have any of you done that? Do you know how to earn an indulgence? Well, you start in Rome, and you go to the Vatican, and then you have to register as a pilgrim, and then you get a sheet of paper, and you have to go to the 7 holy pilgrim churches and visit each of the sacristy and get a stamp. And so I did that. I may be the only Adventist pastor in the world that's done this, but I've done this, okay? And this is confession time for me, I suppose. And so that's what I did. I went to and there's different boxes. Are you Catholic? So just so you know, so the record's straight, I'm not a Jesuit infiltrator. I did not mark I'm Catholic. But it said there was a box for historians, historical purposes research. And I said, yes, that's me. And you have 24 hours, and it's 26 miles. But I managed to get it all done within the 24 hours. I went to all the holy pilgrim churches, and I got my stamp. I was about halfway through, and I was going up to this church, and there was somebody that Ubered. And they looked at me, and I had sweat, and I looked whatever, And they looked at me and they said, "Oh, we're so impressed. Wow, you're such a good, faithful Catholic. In fact, you're a better Catholic than I am." I said, "No. Hey, where are you from?" I said, "Oh, at the time, I'm a missionary. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal." No. We must know. You're a missionary too. That's amazing. "Oh, yeah. Actually, I'm a pastor." What? A religion teacher, pastor? Pastor? They're kind of asking that, and they said, "Wait a minute. But we need to make a recommendation because you're just so more spiritual than we are." And so they kept asking and said, where do you work? And I said, "Well, I teach for a Protestant seminary." And they said, "You're the strangest Protestant I've ever met." But there I was. So, and the reason I did that wasn't that I felt a need to earn an indulgence. I'm a church historian. I teach about Luther. Luther did those same pilgrimage to earn indulgence, and he was partway through when he got on the Pilate's staircase, and I wanted to see this sight, because as he was going up Pilate's staircase on his knees, he heard the words of Scripture, "The just shall live by faith. The just shall live by faith." That we don't have to do outward penance to earn favor before God. That's what I was doing, because I wanted to know what was it like for Luther and so many other Christians throughout history that they had to. So I very proudly have a. Oh, by the way, you want to know something kind of cool? I went back to the Vatican. I got my stamps and I showed them, and they said, "Oh, this is great." Well, the person when I got back only spoke French. My French is not very good, so I was trying to explain. They asked me how long it took me to do this. And did it take you, have you been here a week, is how I understood it. And I said, "Well, look at me. Doesn't it look like I've been here a week?" And so she was asking, because if you take a week and walk to Rome 100 miles and then do the pilgrimage, you get bonus time out of purgatory. And so thanks to miscommunication, I got the bonus indulgence. Praise the Lord, right? I'm just teasing, but you get the idea that there's a lot of Adventists that think they're Catholic. Don't be offended here, but because they're trying to earn their favor before God through the things that they do or don't do. Wesley understood perfection not as what you do on the outside, but rather as a growth of grace in the heart from the inside. And so he talks about perfection as being Christian growth and grace and maturity. That's the favorite term that John Wesley liked to use, and he liked to use the word surrender. And if you actually go back now and look at Steps to Christ, you're going to see what are the words that she uses whenever she talks about perfection. She talks about Christian grace and growth, and the word maturity, and the word surrender. All the same words and terminology that John Wesley. She talks about perfection most often as the work of God's grace in our heart as we grow and mature as Christians. So rather than beat each other up and say, "Oh, you're not perfect yet," she talks about how the work of God is a work that God, the good work that God does when we surrender our hearts and lives to Him. But that Wesleyan understanding undergirded some of the later theological descendants of Wesley who would go much further, such as in Oberlin, who began to focus on perfectionism as the idea of entire consecration. This idea that you have to the role of the will. That's not entirely wrong, except for that they're going in a little bit different direction than Ellen White was. And you're starting to see that perfection, the understanding and definition of perfection, is changing in the late 19th century among Christians, especially among those Christians who become known as the fundamentalist. Okay? Are you hearing, or sticking with me here? Then they have the Keswick group in England. They're talking about perfection and how there has to be a special infilling of the Holy Spirit and infusion of the Spirit to sustain one through the very end of time, a certain kind of holiness, a state of holiness that is achieved. And this is something very different. And they like to use words such as victory, peace, and resting in the Lord. You're starting to see these terms that are being used in different ways among fundamentalists. And then finally you have Dwight L. Moody, who's probably the most famous evangelist, revivalist of the late 19th century. Ellen White loved Dwight L. Moody. She had a number of his books and certainly admired him. He was sort of the Billy Graham of her time. And Dwight Moody was fine, but it was his descendants, Reuben Torrey, who will become very militant against Seventh-day Adventists. He has a tango. He and E.J. Wagner and A.T. Jones have a big tiff, a big fight with each other, and he decides he doesn't like Adventists. Adventists like Moody, but they definitely don't like Torrey. Torrey will become significant because Torrey is one of the main editors of, wait for it, the Fundamentals. Remember those pamphlets? Hey, no surprise there. In fact, he's so upset because when Moody dies, Moody is friendly towards Adventists, Ellen White, and Adventists are friendly to Moody. By the way, Moody's main publisher was Fleming H. Revell. Who does Ellen White have her only book not published by the denomination is published by? Fleming H. Revell, which is what you said, sir, Steps to Christ. Okay, so I hope you see there's some connections here. There's some history, some context. That's really important. Well, Torrey really doesn't like Wagner and Jones. He definitely doesn't like Adventists. And at one point, he decides he's going to. He puts one of the fundamentals, one of the pamphlets, lists all of the groups that are, and he invents a new term called a cult. Yeah, this is where it comes from. And so he lists the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and he actually has basically an expose on Seventh-day Adventists. But intriguingly enough, you remember the guys that are the oil tycoons, Lyman and Milton Stewart, who found Standard Oil? He writes a letter back to Torrey and says, don't touch the Adventists, leave them alone. They know their Bibles better than you think they do, so do not include the Adventists in your expose of cults. And so Adventists, thanks to Lyman and Milton Stewart, who I have absolutely no reason, I don't know why, I don't know if they knew an Adventist or they had some friendly encounter with Adventism, I don't know the rest of the story. All I know is that they said, leave Adventists alone. And so we escaped the first round of the cult wars. We will not escape the second round, but the first round we escaped thanks to all this. And by the way, the holiness movement and all of these things, the network that with Moody and his empire, will have a significant impact on our understanding of the Holy Spirit, the personhood of the Holy Spirit. Ellen White will point to H. Camden Lacey, who's an Adventist religion teacher, and she said he read a couple books from holiness teachers on the Holy Spirit, and she said, this is light and truth. In fact, later she writes in Desire of Ages about Christ's divinity, how it's unborrowed and underived, and she'll make emphatic statements that will nudge the Adventist church to fully embracing the Trinity, and that's a fascinating story in itself. By the way, some people have another way that Adventists are good Catholics is that sometimes we appeal to tradition. And they say, well, some of the early Adventists, they were anti-Trinitarian or maybe semi-anti-Trinitarian or whatever, and so therefore we should be anti-Trinitarian today. And I don't follow that logic because they're appealing to the logic of tradition, because early Adventists believed a certain thing. There's a lot of things our early Adventist pioneers that as they studied things further, they said, oh, that's actually not a really good idea. And so they begin to adopt things like the health message and education and the need for a more Christ-centered approach in Adventism, which is the story of 1888, and many other things as well. And so we have to be a little bit charitable to our pioneers. But when people tell me and say, you should not do this because I found one of our pioneers believing, I said, you're appealing to the authority of tradition. You need to study the historical context and how our pioneers developed and matured their ideas over time. And so that's absolutely vital. Student volunteer movement. Any of you go as student missionaries somewhere? That comes from the 1890s, from Moody and his empire, starts a mass movement of students who will begin sharing and going in mission appointments to different parts of the world. The bottom line is all of these ideas together, when it comes to what I call last generation theology today, in the 1920s among the fundamentalists, were known as the Victorious Life Movement. That's what they like. That's the preferred terminology. In fact, I've had some people say, well, no one in Adventist history talks about last generation theology. And I say, absolutely, you're right. But 100 years ago, if you asked them if they knew about the Victorious Life Movement, and one of those pamphlets that I just found from up there is titled The Victorious Life. I think I've got it in my presentation in just a minute, so I'm pretty excited about that because I think your copy's better than my copy. That's pretty amazing. And so Adventists, as they engaged with fundamentalists and became fundamentalist more and more because they saw themselves as the true fundamentalists, right? The fundamentalists of the fundamentalists also some Adventists began embracing these fundamentalist ideas of perfectionism that were very new and different from Ellen White and Methodism and some of these other kinds of things. And the victorious life meant that you have to live a victorious life, a perfect life, in order to experience true and entire sanctification. And Adventists, all they did when they did fundamentalism is they took that a little bit further and said, true and that complete sanctification, that is the experience that happens in the time of trouble in order to be fully perfect so that Christ will come and they can go through the very end time events. And just to help illustrate the vast influence of the victorious life or fundamentalist ideas, because it represents a shift in thinking, a different way of approaching how we understand sanctification or perfectionism, people like A.F. Ballinger began to embrace these ideas. And one of the key terms of the victorious life movement was power for witnessing, how to have true power in your Christian experience. And he actually wrote this book. Now, he will keep going with his ideas where he eventually questions the sanctuary and makes his way out of Adventism. But this is just an early example of Adventism going in this direction. Here, this is a page in the review. Advertising, check this out. Literature on the victorious life. This isn't fundamentalist literature. This is Adventist literature, taking fundamentalist literature and applying it to Adventist theology and teaching it. This was hot stuff in the 1920s. This is where we start having these perils of fundamentalism. And some of the leading theologians of the church, like Meade McGuire, he writes a book called The Life of Victory. And you read through the whole book, you're like, this is all about the victorious life teachings. And I actually now use the terminology victorious life Adventism to show the connection between the victorious life and Adventist theology and Adventist fundamentalism through all of this. Now, there were some that were more moderate. There was W.W. Prescott. He wrote a book called Victory in Christ, and he actually writes a series of articles, and he says, well, they kind of have an idea, but if the victorious life is dependent on me, then we are in trouble. Instead, we need to have the victorious life dependent on Christ, and then it's okay. And I would fully agree with that. The challenge of last generation theology or victorious life Adventism is when we make sanctification about ourselves instead of Jesus. Like a lot of ideas throughout church history, heresy, if I dare say so, happens when there is a truth that becomes distorted. Okay? And so that's what I'm trying to talk about here. We have George B. Thompson, Secretary of the General Conference in most of the 1920s. He will go around to all the camp meetings, and his favorite series and topic that he loved to talk about was the victorious life. Matilda Andros writes a book, and that's where I just found a copy I was so excited about, The Life That Wins. All throughout the book, it permeates with victorious life teachings. One of the favorite terms is let go and let God. Have you heard that before? Yes. Yeah, that comes from the victorious life movement. And she talks about this. Truly the self-denying life is the strong life. It is the victorious life. It is the life that grows more and more satisfying as one travels toward the western slope. We have yet to hear of one who has regretted choosing to let go and to let God, choosing to live the life that wins. In other words, as you read more and more of her book, if we could just follow, and interestingly enough, there's so much that talks about, if we could just follow the health message perfectly, if we just followed all these different things perfectly, then we could make Christ come. Here's my copy of The Life That Wins. Now, I think this copy here is going to be better. I'm going to replace my picture with your picture. Thank you. But yeah, and this was a favorite image, is being in a boat. a ship that's sinking and that getting rescued. And if we could only, the only way to be rescued is to be perfect enough. Mead McGuire, the other guy I just told you about, here's his book. Check this out. Which is being said these days concerning the victorious life, and with so much preaching, praying, and discussion, the question arises, why do so few seem to experience complete deliverance from sin? Because when you're focused on being perfect yourself, oftentimes what ends up happening is you start focusing on others who need to be perfect too, and how they're not measuring up. Ever seen that before? I got turned into the General Conference for heresy one time. Well, let me explain first. I had a person who, long ago and far away, and at the time I was the White Estate Director at Loma Linda, and a church leader called me up from a local conference constituency and said, oh, I'm sending someone to see you. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's not. You never know. So he comes to me, and sure enough, another week or two later comes by, and he comes, and he has an appointment, comes to see me, and he plops down a big pile of Ellen White quotes and says, the church is in apostasy. And I said, well, why? Well, then he threw down another binder. And you know what he'd been doing? For like the last decade before that, every church periodical he could, he was looking at them, and every time there was a advertisement for a tour for the Holy Land, he was clipping that as proof that the church was in apostasy. And I thought to myself, well, And he said, well, read the quotes. And I said, well, I don't think they're saying what... He said, you need to read them more carefully. I said, okay, come back next week and I'll read them. So he comes back the next week. You see, proof now that the church is in apostasy. And I said, well, I don't think the quotes are saying what you think they're saying. He said, well, you clearly have not read them carefully enough. I said, well, thank you, sir. Let me read them again. Let's meet again next week. So I reread them again. So I had read them like 10 times now. And he comes back the next week and he says, well, do you see the light? And I said, well, I don't see the same light that you do. He said, well, how can you not see it? How can you be so blind? And I said, well, maybe it's how we interpret Ellen White's writings. What do you mean, how we interpret Ellen White's writings? I said, well, I'm reading the same things. And Ellen White makes some quotes that along the lines of, you do not have to go to the Holy Land in order to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, was she forbidding anyone from ever traveling to the Holy Land? Well, no. But in the 1890s, it became very popular, especially among wealthier Americans, to do what was called a grand tour and go to the Holy Land. And those that went to the Holy Land, kind of a pilgrimage that you were more spiritual, right? And so Ellen White is countering that and trying to tell church members, you're better off spending your money for missions and helping other people than spending lots of money yourself traveling all the way around the world to one of these grand tours, which usually would take at least a year to do. So she's saying, you don't need to do that. You don't need that to be spiritual. Was she forbidding people? Well, no, not at all. And so then we started talking about, and so we met every week for a number of months, and finally got to the end of it. And he looked at me, and he said, I see you have a point, but I don't like it. And every time I see one of my fellow church members and they're buying some things at the grocery store that I know Ellen White wouldn't approve of, I don't rebuke them in the grocery store. I wait till they get to the parking lot. And then I rebuke them there. I said, well, sir, who gave you the job of rebuking other people? Well, he didn't have an answer. I don't know. I guess, yeah, maybe it's not our job to be the Holy Spirit and to be conscience for other people. So eventually he didn't like what I had to say, so he reported me to Jan Paulsen for heresy, and Jan Paulsen sent a message back, great job, keep it up. So there we go. Yeah. Jan Paulsen's my good friend now. We did an oral history during the pandemic, and he's a pretty cool former General Conference president. Mead McGuire, his cross and mine. Christ has his cross. We have our cross that we have to bear. If we only bear our cross perfectly, thank you, that we will be able to therefore be perfect. And he begins quoting Great Controversy, page 623, about God's final people have to go through a victorious life experience through the very end time events, have a perfect character without any sin or imperfections. And only when that is done are God's people able to stand without a mediator at the very end of time. Does that sound familiar? When I was a young person, I was so scared of the end of time. I was so scared that I would do drills to my hiding spot in the woods so that I knew where I was going to hang out. And so I had my emergency go pack so that when people came to get us, because we were Sabbath keepers, then you know what I realized after having that mentality growing up was that the only thing I was focused on was me. And that my theology had become actually, in fact, very selfish because I was afraid because I was only focused on myself. But if you actually reread through Great Controversy and these different statements about end-time events, Ellen White makes it crystal clear that God's people will be focused on others, will care more about the salvation of others than they will about themselves, and that they will be sustained through all of the final events leading up to the eschaton by the grace of God. Not through their own strength, not because they were so able to get off the grid or anything else like that. And I'm not saying what you should or shouldn't do this afternoon, but the only way God's people survive the end times is through the grace of Jesus Christ. Amen. And so the danger is that we too often make end time events an Adventist understanding of prophetic chronology and everything else about ourselves instead about Jesus. E.M. Peebles, she talks about this. We must live the victorious life here if we would sing the victor song over there. I'm not going to read the whole quote for the sake of time this afternoon because I want to leave a little bit of time for discussion and Q&A, and we can talk about all kinds of different things. But C.E. Edwardson, he talks about this as well in connection with the end of probation. I'm going to actually fast forward here to Taylor Bunch. He writes a famous book called The Exodus in Type and Antitype. It will actually be hugely influential in the 20th century in Adventist thinking. Bunch compared the Gethsemane experience of Christ as a model for God's people after the close of probation that they must overcome the same way that Christ overcame, the Gethsemane kind of experience. And quote, the Advent movement will be cleansed and purified in the same way by the shaking out of the mixed multitude. In other words, we need to get rid of those who are less pure in order for the pure to make it through the end of times. And this is actually becomes a very, what I would argue is a very unbiblical concept that we have to cause the shaking. Will there be a shaking? Well, yes, there will be, but it's because of what you and I do? Well, God forbid. No, it's because what the Holy Spirit will do at the end of time. We're not supposed to actually do the shaking. If the parable of Jesus is any indication, let the wheat and the tares grow. It's Jesus who comes in with the sickle, and it's Jesus who will do the separating, not us. But Bunch is teaching this. Here, check this out. The Advent movement will be cleansed by a great spiritual revival and reformation brought by the preaching of the Laodicean message. The purifying message shakes out the worldly and the rebellious. And it's interesting. He starts coming up with a list of all these kinds of things that characterize the worldly and the rebellious. And one of my hobbies right now, I guess you'd say, is I like to find all those lists of things that characterize the worldly and the rebellious. Well, he has 4 that he talks about in his book, but one of my favorites, any of you ever listen to the radio in your cars? You are the worldly and the rebellious. At least 100 years ago in Adventism you were. No, I'm serious. The radio, that was positively devilish. Yeah. Things have changed just a little bit. Yeah. Health reform. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. Remember my vegan potluck police? Yeah, how could you forget, right? Yeah. Well, this is sort of their source of inspiration here. So that ancient Israel was given the manna from heaven, so therefore this angel food is what will prepare God's people at the end of time, the health message, following the true health message. False witnessing that they have to be ready for translation to achieve complete victory over the terrible evils. The problem of marriage and divorce, you're seeing growing divorce, and that this is a sign amongst God's people that a shaking is needed. And then finally, a spirit of reverence, that we need to have more reverence. In other words, and they usually would equate that to silence in church, that you should be quiet and stuff like that, which actually is very interesting, a history of how we've worshipped in the history of Adventism, but they're pushing for a very, very kind of what I would call a high church in terms of that And I'm not saying we shouldn't be reverent, but they interpret that in a way that means, that very, very, very stern kind of way. Carl B. Haynes will be famous for pushing for these kinds of ideas, teaching the victorious life. He will actually take an interesting twist to it, and that he will actually begin. Last night I mentioned how the fundamentalist movement started developing a theology of hierarchy and a theology of segregation. Because how do we go from a church that was abolitionist in the 19th century to a church by the early 20th century is so segregated that we start to have black and white conferences? And part of it has to do with theology. And Carl B. Haynes, and there are others, begin to articulate a theology that is mirrored from the fundamentalists, in which, not all fundamentalists, but some fundamentalists, I should say, in which they are arguing for a black and white heaven. Some of probably the most unfortunate things I've ever run across in Adventist history, in my research. And so when I tell people what you believe in theology actually really matters and has very real implications and consequences. This is a good example, because we started proof texting certain Ellen White quotes a certain way to justify that we should basically have separate churches, separate conferences, all of this, and we start moving in a very different direction. And I've written this up in a couple of different places, in articles and chapters and books in the last year that you can read if you want to. It's not a point that I like spending a lot of time dwelling on, because it's not the happy kind of Adventist history. I prefer telling happy stories of our pioneers and the good things, but I would not be a good historian if I didn't also tell you some of the challenges and problematic aspects too. And that's what I'm also trying to highlight and this is a challenge. And we also see the same theology of hierarchy in terms of male headship is where it really begins to be promulgated and taught in fundamentalist circles in the 1920s. And we go from a church that in 1910, where there's something like 1,000 women who are in church leadership, evangelists, pastors, even Bible workers, a wide variety of positions. You see a lot of involvement by women, so that by 1930, there's hardly any, basically none. So how did we go to a church that was very embracing of women and very integrated to a church that was largely segregated and where women's involvement in leadership had largely evaporated? This has everything to do with what we believe, and it has everything to do with some of these fundamentalist notions in theology, the theological ideas that were going on. Yes, sir?
Didn't the same thing happen in the early Christian church?
Yeah, there's some parallels in the early Christian church. That's actually a really great observation. I actually have written up some stuff, worked on that thought, because the early Christian church had a heresy that was known as docetism. And that was this idea that there is some Christians who are more perfect than the other Christians, and that if you morally fall, then you invalidate all that's gone before. And that became basically, it's not all things the same, but kind of a version of the same problem with perfectionism in last generation theology that I'm trying to address this afternoon. Not all people saw this way. I wanted to acknowledge there's some nuance in Adventist history. W.W. Prescott, in this case, turns out to be one of my heroes, one of the leading voices of the 1919 Bible Conference. He'll actually write an article because he wants to balance out. He actually sees fundamentalism as a good word. If you asked Prescott and said, "Are we fundamentalists?" he would have also said, "Yes, of course we are." But he said we need to take a more gospel-centered approach to fundamentalism. Very interesting. And so he writes this. He's talking about in terms of the covenant, the old covenant, the new covenant. He says the new covenant gives before it demands. The old covenant was a covenant of works. He sees two different theologies developing within Adventism, and he finds especially problematic the theology that the people that are teaching that we should live without a mediator. He's thinking especially of those Adventists who are saying we have to live without a mediator at the very end of time, because no, there is no time, even in all eternity after glorification when Jesus comes, do we not need a mediator? There never comes a time when we don't need Jesus Christ. It's, again, this problem of proof texting. By the way, some of you are saying, well, did Ellen White really say that? Did she really? Well, let's look at a couple statements by Ellen White to unpack how she understood Christian perfection. I like this. She says, perfection of character can be only attained through Jesus Christ. She understood perfection as centered on the person of Jesus. He will be the one who lifts fallen humanity if men will believe on him as their personal Savior. And again, the term that she uses more than anything else is the word surrender. And she also describes our sanctification experience not as the work of a moment, but the work of a lifetime. You've probably heard, there's several variations of that quote, but the idea is there. And then she talks about this: every day we may advance in perfection of Christian character. So she did not see this as a punctiliar, one-point kind of process, but as a linear process in which people are constantly growing throughout their Christian life. And just like, I would say it's like a marriage. You know, my wife and I, we still have disagreements, right? I think every good marriage, you have different perspectives and different agreements and disagreements on things, right? That's part of any relationship, right? But I would hope and think, I like to think that marriage has gotten better after 23 years, right? But the things that we see differently than we did when we first got married over 2 decades ago. And in fact, we were reminiscing about this because we're going to, my wife's getting ready to do some research, and then I'm going to meet her for a little bit. And we're talking about when we first went to Europe on our honeymoon, that we did those roundabouts and had disagreements on directions and stuff like that. And I think we've gotten a lot better at getting around and doing directions, even on the left side of the road, as they like to do it in England. But you get the point. I think that relationships mature and grow. And the same thing's true with how Ellen White understood. And I think that's probably one of the best examples. And she also places it in the context of what my friend Nick Miller likes to describe, the moral government of God. That was an important concept in her understanding of the Great Controversy, and that God's people at the end of time will be a part of God's government, showing and demonstrating for all the universe that God is just. So I hope you see the difference, because last generation theology says that it's God's people, the emphasis is on God's people who demonstrate before the universe that they are perfect, but the focus is on them. And so, there, as I said earlier, there will be a last generation. It's not because any people suddenly achieve a certain spiritual super status. It's because they are fully surrendered to Jesus Christ, and their eyes are so focused on Jesus and their relationship with Jesus that all people see is Jesus, and God's character is demonstrated and revealed through those people at the end of time. The focus, it's all about the focus. Where is the emphasis? Is it on myself and me being perfect, or is it on Jesus and being perfectly surrendered to Jesus? Do you see the difference? The two are not far apart, but yet they are. By the way, also in the 1920s, I find that that's when they start proof texting a certain Ellen White quote from Christ's Object Lessons. You probably know the quote about Christ's character being perfectly reproduced in his people. That becomes the most quoted, or I would argue misquoted quote of all time by Ellen White. And it starts being quoted widely in the 1920s with victorious life literature. And I'll show that in my next book that I'll be, once I get 1925 finished. So you guys get a sneak preview here this afternoon. W.C. White, the son of Ellen White. Remember the one I showed you the picture of with the little kid this morning with his arms like this, right? That's him now as an old man. And some people ask, well, how am I going to live in Christian perfection? And he said that the counsel that he remembered from his mother is that we will live as if Christ were to come tomorrow, but we will prepare for service as if we have years of labor to come. In other words, we live each day expecting in constant expectation of Christ's soon return, and yet at the same time, we also prepare to do our best to advance the mission of the gospel to all the world, and that is the best way to live. By the way, I skipped one of my slides. I must have accidentally deleted it, but there's actually a really fun series of articles. I have it in my 1922 book, if you want to check it out. I talked about how women were kind of ellipsed out of leadership in Adventism in the 1920s. The 1920s become the great era where women's behavior and dress becomes incredibly prescripted. And one of my favorite, or not favorite, but one of the most intriguing articles, and I pointed this out to my wife, somebody wrote, was the reason why Jesus hasn't come. Are you ready for this? Are you ready for this? It's because you ladies have bobbed hair, short hair, and high heels. So no offense to any of you ladies, but you're the reason Jesus hasn't come. If you don't believe me and say, did he really? Check it out. In fact, I had a Adventist historian friend who said, Michael, no way. And so then he read my book. He read the chapter in there, and I had the citation in there. And then he looked up the original article, and he said, Michael, you were very kind in how you said that. You're very generous in holding back. And I said, yes, I know. Thank you. Yeah. So some conclusions, and then we have about, I think, half an hour or so to be able to go through some questions. I've talked about the promise and the peril. There is a lot of promise. We need to uphold the Bible as the Word of God and the validity of miracles and the atonement of Christ. But there is also peril in terms of how we interpret inspired writings, especially Ellen White's writings. And there's a lot of danger in terms of last generation theology, or what they would have called victorious life teachings, okay? We can see the origins that go back to Andreasen and even earlier to Jones and Wagner. I've tried to highlight some of the formative background aspects in connection to the victorious life movement and how it became part of fundamentalism and how these ideas began to shift within Adventism. Some Adventists would adopt these ideas even further, calling for Adventists to achieve Christian perfection in order to explain the delay of the eschaton. Such innovations, especially by Meade McGuire, Matilda Andros, and I would probably add Taylor Bunch in there, become purveyors of this new, what we identify as Adventist historians as last generation theology. Thus, the true genesis whereby last generation theology becomes popularized within Adventism is in direct connection with these holiness teachings, or what I would say is fundamentalism, and prominent both among fundamentalists and Adventist fundamentalism, those Adventists that are embracing fundamentalism, especially in the 1920s. Also, last generation theology would become pervasive within Adventism, utilizing proof texts, these very specific Ellen White quotes, and that's how we can, that's the problem, is Ellen White wrote so much that you can cherry pick. If you work hard enough, you can cherry pick, and you can almost make Ellen White say whatever you want to say. And here you have about Christ's character being perfectly reproduced in his people. By the way, some people ask me and say, what's the best way to refute the misuse of that quotation in Christ's Object Lessons, page 69? Context, literary context. Just read the chapter in which the quote is found there. She talks about Christian perfection as Christian growth and grace and maturity and surrender. Read the chapter. Don't read just the quote. If you read the chapter, it all makes a whole bunch of sense. Our problem is that we haven't taken Ellen White seriously enough. Okay? By the way, if some of you are like, I haven't read Ellen White in a long time, or there might even be some of you said, I've actually never read Ellen White. Pick up Steps to Christ. Easy read. And if you haven't read her book, Steps to Christ, and recently, do so again. It's worth your time to read Steps to Christ. By the way, a little Adventist history trivia for you. When she published Steps to Christ with Fleming H. Revell, which she did, it's a bestseller. Eventually, she bought back the rights to the book. And some people ask, well, why did she do that? Well, because she wanted to have it translated. Fleming Revell wasn't going to translate the book because they just did one-time printings and weren't into doing translations. So they said, well, if you want to translate your book, you just buy back the rights and then you translate it yourself. And Ellen White, intriguingly, I've done a study of this, and Ellen White is unique compared to her contemporaries and her peers, other major religious figures of the 19th century. I'm thinking of like Phoebe Palmer and others. They didn't want their writings published, or translated into other languages. They strongly resisted it. Ellen White was the opposite. She embraced the idea of translation and wanted her writings translated in as many languages as she possibly could. And I've tracked down where Steps to Christ, I believe it was 36 languages is translated into over 36 languages by the time that she passed away, and the most recent time I checked, I think it was over 300 languages that it's currently translated in. I've actually been working with Tim Poyer at the White Estate to try to update that list, but somewhere in that range. So quite remarkable how she saw her writings being translated. So, but back to my main point. If you haven't read her writings recently, read Steps to Christ, read Desire of Ages, read Christ's Object Lessons, read Ministry of Healing, read Great Controversy. Actually read her writings. Don't snippet little cherry-pick bits and pieces here and there. And make sure she actually said it. This drives me bonkers on social media because I find all kinds of quotes that supposedly Ellen White said. By the way, for the right price, I'll make up any Ellen White quote for you that you want. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Don't put that on social media. I'm just kidding. No, don't do that. Don't do that. That's bad. But no, seriously, this is a problem where people are claiming there's certain quotes by Ellen White. And she never really said it. And that's a big problem. And so make sure she actually said it. But read her writings. Read Steps to Christ. Read Desire of Ages. You don't have to wonder. There's no secret writings here. It makes sense. And despite this, not all Adventists advocated for sinless perfection. There should be some nuance here. People like W.W. Prescott, and there were others, who advocated for a much more moderate position and argued for a more kind of, I would say, healthy and balanced theology in terms of not pushing for such theological extremes of inerrancy and infallibility and what we today call last generation theology, especially this idea of living sinless without a mediator, which he considered a mark of nothing short of the old covenant, and that made Adventist theology fall woefully short. So we covered a lot of ground this afternoon. And I've tried to leave enough time that we have a little bit of time, and this is my favorite part, is Q&A, and this is a wild card. Anything in Ellen White or Adventist history that you want to ask, anything from my presentation, both this afternoon or during the time that we've been together, or maybe something I haven't talked about at all, but is just burning on your heart, and you're just like, I have to know something about whatever this topic is, and because you're my front row student here, my A student here, that you get to have the privilege of asking the first and probably the hardest question too. Go for it.
Didn't Andros write a book against Ballinger? And yet they're kind of in the same line?
Yeah, so they're in the same theological trajectory, but Ballinger goes a different direction. I would say that's more than just the understanding of perfection and sinless perfection and that kind of thing. Ballinger also basically how you understand Adventist theology, not just perfection, but also your understanding of the big picture. And here's the simple way of explaining it, that in Adventist, in church history, there's two big camps within Protestantism about how one understands this. And there's the Calvinist that focus on determinism and predestination, and then there's Arminians like the Methodists who focus on free will and free choice. And the easiest and simplest way to describe Ballinger's theology is that he was effectively a Calvinist, or whether he realized it or not, he was advocating Calvinist ideas of predestination. Well, here's the thing, is if you believe that everything's predestined, the idea of a cleansing of a sanctuary where Jesus is in heaven working on our behalf actually makes no sense at all. So he rejected the sanctuary, and that's what got him in a lot of trouble. So there were different theological issues that...
It's a sanctuary that Andros was answering.
Yes, exactly. So that's really what's happening. By the way, I would also argue that this is the same thing that happened with Desmond Ford in 1980. If you really want to understand Desmond Ford and his theology, he was arguing for basically a Calvinist form of Adventism. If you read his writings very carefully, and it actually kind of makes sense because his advisor at, where was it in England? F.F. Bruce, I think it was Manchester, where he was studying that he was a Calvinist, and so you start to see why Desmond Ford and Ballinger actually have a lot of interesting parallels. But the Cliff Note version is they were trying to make Adventism Calvinist.
Whenever I read the transcript of what Ford said at PUC,
yeah,
I said, "Wow, that sounds like 40 reasons, what was it that Bellinger wrote, the 40 reasons why he rejected the church?
Very similar, very similar. And once you move from the camp of Arminian and Wesleyan theology of free will and free choice to the Calvinist camp of predeterminism and foreknowledge and everything else, you just have to throw out the sanctuary. It just doesn't make theological sense at all. And that's what happened there. Yeah.
I just wanted to speak a little bit on Mrs. White's definition of character perfection. I've never really found any direct statement where she said exactly what that is, and the closest I've found is in Steps to Christ, page 62, where she says, Adam, before the fall, failed to perfect his character. So we know that Adam had inherent righteousness already.
Yeah.
But he wasn't loyal.
Yeah. And this comes back to this theology of the moral government of God. And
It's more
that's
of the loyalty issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Good observation. Yes, thank you. Great questions this afternoon.
I've just discovered that just about all of Ellen White's materials are available in audio form.
Yeah.
And have been just starting in Arthur White's biography. And of course, he was Ellen White's grandson.
Right.
And head of the
White
of the estate for many years.
That's right.
And I can remember him going around making presentations, perhaps very much like you are doing here. Is it safe to assume that even though he was her grandson, that I can count on those books as being, on his biography, as being entirely objective? And perhaps, is there anything he should have included in those books that, in that biography, that was left out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of, Arthur White was, you're talking to someone who's a trained professional historian. So to talk to somebody and say, well, what do you think of this person who's, he was certainly the grandson of Ellen White, and I think he did the very best he could. But as a professional historian, you want to emphasize historical context and a lot of those other kinds of things. He wasn't a professional historian. He was trying to write a narrative. Now, the other thing I will say is that when I was a teenager, and once I started seeing a more positive view of Ellen White and falling in love with Adventist history and all of that, Mervyn Maxwell is a good friend and mentor that I dedicated my dissertation to his memory. He was very influential in my life. And I found those 6 volumes really an eye-opening experience. So I read those, and they helped me to pursue Ellen White studies even further. But I don't want to be a snobby historian and be like, oh, well, I think they're amazing. I also think they reflect the best research in the church from 50 years ago. And there's been a lot of research that's been done there. And just to be kind of fair, I look at some of my own research that I did 20 years ago. I'm like, well, Michael, that was the best you could do back then. That's actually really terrible. But we're still all learning and growing, right? We're all learning and growing. And I'm married to a professional historian. She's an early modern historian. She's a women's historian. And so we edit each other's stuff. And so that challenges us to work harder and be better historians. And so, but there's sometimes my wife says, Michael, you could do better. Yeah, and I say that to her too, just to keep her humble as well. And it's good because that's part of history as we learn and grow. And honestly, there's more materials that we know of, more contextual materials that we know of, than what Arthur White. And we would expect that if you write about someone that's a family member of yours, you're probably going to have a little bit different rose-tinted glasses than you would if you weren't. That's just reality too, okay? So there are those aspects. I'm not trying to criticize his biography. They are what they are. I think they're very good and positive. I even recommend them for people that want to journey through Ellen White's life. I do think there needs to be a new biography of Ellen White written, that's very thorough and so on. So use them, but recognize what they are, and they are what they are. They were created at a certain time and place and reflect certain aspects. I say that in a gesture of humility that my own work sometimes needs improvement, and I've learned and grown, and that's in more recent years. And so we're all on a journey. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So you alluded to the quote, when the image of God is fully reproduced in his people.
Yeah, Christ
he'll come
Object
back.
Lesson 69. Mm-hmm.
So I have always thought that was, and see if this is, I'm just kind of curious if you think this is way off, but I've always thought that is Christ up in heaven putting a jigsaw puzzle together, and we're all the pieces, and he's telling his Father, a couple more pieces, and I'll have the picture done, and it looks just like you, and we'll be able to go get them. I don't know, in all of your research, where do you think that quote actually, how do you interpret it?
Yeah. So the way I interpret it is Christ's character reproduced in his people, but that, the context of that statement, that chapter, read the chapter, talks about Christian growth and maturity, and talks about perfect surrender. Actually, that's very interesting. She doesn't just say surrender, although she uses that term too, but she also uses the term perfect surrender. And so where perfection is achieved is when our wills are fully and completely surrendered to Jesus Christ. And that's clearly, to me, the context in which she's writing that is that God's people are perfectly surrendered. Now, our fallacy is that we think it's all about ourselves, okay? That we think that the second coming of Christ is dependent on you and I. And it's not. It's not. How are God's people described at the very end of time? Here is the patience of the saints. So we're called not to be perfect so much as we are called to be perfectly surrendered. We're tasked with, during whatever time that we have, to be faithful and patient, living each and every day as if it were our last, or as if we had many more years to come. We continue on in that trajectory, perfectly surrendering our life to Jesus each and every day. Is it possible any of us could be lost? Absolutely. But our job in the meantime is to make sure each and every day we surrender our will, give our hearts to Christ, say, God, please work in and through me, make me more like you today. And that's what God calls us to do. And whatever time we have left, people ask, well, why? Why hasn't Christ come? Well, I don't have a good answer. The only answer that makes any sense to me at all is God is patient, and he's given us just a little bit more time to be able to advance the beautiful gospel message that we have to all the world. This morning I put on the slides how many people groups, how many language groups have still never heard of Jesus Christ. Let's never, ever get to the point where we are complacent and think we've already done all the work that needs to be done. Why are we focused on being the vegan police when Jesus has called us to go and share the gospel to people who've never heard the gospel of Jesus Christ? I'm going to get my soapbox for just a minute, but I'll tell you one more story. One more quick story. I had a church member, and this is a different church member, but they got really upset that the Pathfinders were selling cookie dough as a fundraiser. They got angry. In fact, they were so angry that one time I came to church, and it was a church probably about this size. I looked out in the audience and I saw a general conference vice president, very famous. All of you would recognize his name. And being a good pastor and a young pastor and a rather intimidated young pastor at that moment, I went up to this very famous Adventist and said, Elder so-and-so, what a privilege it is to have you here today. Oh, Michael, I'm just here on vacation. So glad to see you. I said, would you like to preach today? And I wish he said, Pastor, I wish he said yes. Because he said, no, I'm on vacation. I just came here to church. Please go ahead and share. Don't even think that just try to pretend I'm not here. I'm just here to be here in fellowship and worship with you all. Very, very humble, very kind, generous person. And so I get ready to preach. And then this person in my church, who at that point was not baptized, but he'd been attending, and he thought he was the potluck police too, okay, because he's upset about cookie dough. And I get up to preach, and he stands up in front of the pulpit and starts denouncing the Pathfinders in church. And it's always when somebody famous shows up at your church that the stupidest, craziest, weirdest things ever happen. Because I thought, oh, how embarrassing. We have a general conference, this famous Adventist, oh my goodness, I can't believe he's going to think that the church is like this all the time. Oh my goodness, I'm so horribly embarrassed. And I was thinking, well, how do I do this? And he said, so I said to him, I let him talk for about a minute, and I said, sir, thank you for your opinion. We're all welcome to different opinions here, but this is not the appropriate time or place. And I did it very calmly, just like I'm talking to you now. Do you think he listened? No, he kept on ranting and raving. I mean, he was really worked up. And I said, sir, please, it's time for the sermon. Would you please be seated? And do you think he sat down? Still no. I said, sir, please, I'm going to ask the deacons to escort you out if you will not be seated. And finally, he sat down. Oh my goodness, how embarrassing. A little bit more of the story. You see, he and his wife wanted to be baptized. And they came to me and said, Pastor, we would like to be baptized. And I said to him, come talk to me in my office. And when we sat down in my office, I had still to this day, the nicest office I've ever had. Beautiful office. And a long conference table. And I noticed when I sat down in the middle, and they sat down on either side. That's a little weird. So after about 5 minutes, I said, I can't help but notice you're on opposite ends of the room. Seems a little unusual. How do you feel about your marriage on a scale of 1 to 10? And he says right away, it's like a 7, maybe a 6. And then I looked over at her, and she couldn't even say anything because tears started coming down her eyes. She was so choked up. Eventually she said, Pastor, she could barely get it out, it's a 0. I said, what seems to be the problem? Now tears started coming down his eyes. He said, Pastor, I'm addicted to pornography. So, maybe instead of cookie dough, we need to worry about this whole pornography thing.
Hello.
And, and before you get baptized, we're going to get you some help because they were poor and couldn't afford any counseling. He said, the church will pay for your counseling if you will go see this Christian counselor. And did he go see the Christian counselor? No, instead he kept going around to all the church saying, the pastor's so mean, he won't baptize me. Turkey. I can say this now, it's been a long time, and so on. But turkey. But and you know why? Because pastors, we can't tell people. So then the elder's like, pastor, why are you so mean? You not baptize that person. So, I can't talk to you about it. Because as a pastor, there's confidentiality. I can't tell you the reasons I won't choose to baptize somebody. But I can tell you this, what pastor in their right mind doesn't baptize somebody if they can at all possibly do so? Right? Yeah. So he was worried about cookie dough, and his wife was worried about his pornography. So you tell me what's the bigger problem here? And I think there's a truth here that we tend to overcompensate when we're dealing with certain kinds of things. If we don't surrender those things to God, that we tend to overcompensate. And so instead of actually dealing with the sin in his own life, he's trying to whip other people into shape. And so he's overcompensating with the health message and being rigid. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be health reformers. We should be health reformers, but we should be health reformers for the right reason, because we love Jesus. If we have a loving relationship with Jesus, instead of hitting people over the head with health reform, that we invite them in a contagious way to want to live more healthfully, so that through the health message that they hopefully learn to love Jesus more. Do you see the difference? Yeah. Okay, go ahead. I don't know who's, oh, I'm sorry, back there. All right. Yeah.
Hi. I'm a preacher's daughter.
Okay.
And for my entire life, there have been music wars.
Oh.
And I get tired of them.
Sure.
I run into people who, for them, it's not a preference. It's either a moral issue, even a salvific, boy, go blank on that one.
You're good enough.
Salvation,
That's good.
Issue. And I'm curious from your
Yeah.
historical perspective, has it always been like this? And do we have any hope that it's going to go away?
No, it's not going to go away. Yeah, good luck with that. But I do have a lot of fun teaching about this in Adventist history. You know, the most escalated worship wars in the history of our church were in the 1870s over whether we should or should not use the organ. And I'm not kidding. Someday I'm going to write an article. I haven't had time to write all the articles and books I want to write. I keep trying, but I'm trying. Yeah, I get up every morning. I write for 2 hours. That's what I do. Yeah, I can't. If I keep thinking of new ideas, I can't help myself. But someday I'm going to write an article and put all the worship wars and the early Adventist pioneers, because some people are arguing you shouldn't have any musical instruments at all. And James White was a radical who came in and said we should have an organ. And check this out. I found it on eBay. An original picture of the organ that was used in the Battle Creek Dime Tabernacle. I'm going to put that with my article. Nice. Yeah, it's pretty cool. And that was probably the most controversial instrument in all of Adventist history. And eventually they said, you know what? Maybe it's not the organ, but how we play the organ that makes all the difference. Let me tell you one more story, and then I'll get to, there's a couple more questions, but this is a fun story. I was a pastor at another church long ago and far away. And in that church, my church members had no problem drinking tea and coffee, but they hated drums. If there were drums, I knew I'd be doing funerals. I knew I'd be doing funerals. There would be heart attacks. I'd lose half my church. Okay, so it'd be bad. It'd be bad. And then I was asked to go train pastors in northeastern India, in Mizoram. It took permission from 3 countries to get into this area. It's so remote that when I landed and got there, they actually, this took holy boldness, but they denied my visa. I took the denied visa, and they marked approved and stamped me a stamp to get in. I couldn't believe they did that, but it had to be a miracle of God that I even got in. But when I got there were little kids, and they came up, and they said they wanted to touch me. Wow, we've never seen a real white person before. We thought you were only on TV. Yeah, so this is kind of place, and in this particular area, it's where you see pictures of mountainsides covered with tea. So I was a guest of the Union Mission president and stayed in his home, and the next morning at breakfast, I asked a question that I like to ask when I travel to different countries around the world, different places, and I said, well, what does the church struggle with here? What are the challenges that the church here faces? And the mission president said, you know, the struggle in my place is that church members are a little too enthusiastic about disfellowshipping each other over drinking tea. And then I went to church, and there were drums bigger than me. And I asked them, probably a stupid question, but I said, well, how do you tell the difference between these drums and some of these animist villages where they play the drums and stuff like that? And they looked at me and said, oh, pastor. Like, that was a stupid question, but they were very kind. Oh, pastor, it's all in how you play them. And sure enough, we had church, and they played those huge drums, and it was beautiful, worshipful music. I was lifted up on high. Now, check this out. My home church, that was a pastor of, drums evil, tea and coffee good. I go to this other country, drums good, tea and coffee evil. In fact, emergency disfellowshipping, if you get caught, same day. That's not even following the church manual. It's supposed to wait 2 weeks. But same day discipline, emergency. And so then I went to the ABC, which was a corrugated metal thing that you rolled up. And I wanted to get a Steps to Christ in the local language because I like to collect those and some other things. But I couldn't believe my eyes because right above the top was a whole row of Coca-Cola. So you get disfellowshipped over drinking tea, but you can buy Coca-Cola. I actually bought one because I just had to have one. Yeah. And whole row there on the thing. So I went and found the mission president later that night because I was staying at his house. I said, "Sir, I couldn't help but notice that at the ABC that you are selling Coca-Cola." He said, "You saw that?" I said, "Well, yes." And then he looked me in the eyes and he said, "Well, Michael, no one's ever really proven that Coca-Cola has caffeine." And to his credit, in his country, they don't put the ingredients on the bottle. Yeah. So we choose to believe what we want to believe sometimes, and something I've learned as I've traveled different countries, cultures, and places, is sometimes maybe we should be a little bit more charitable in how we understand and apply these kinds of things to our lives and our various different individual situations. And what could be something good in one context could be positively harmful in another context. I don't know if any of you have water bottles. I think I had one I have one right even here up front. There's another country in Asia. If you brought a water bottle inside the sanctuary, that would be tantamount to sin. But when I worship in that country and I've preached in that country, I make sure I don't bring a water bottle to church because I don't want to offend them. Does that make sense? In certain cultures, I'm not saying you should not bring water bottles to church, but we have to understand each other's cultures and how we apply these kinds of things in different ways. One more funny story, and I'll take the last few questions. This is the kind of thing that I like to do. I like to ask questions, but I'll tell you where I was. I was in Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar. Very cool country to visit, by the way. Also very cold. And so I was in Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, as training pastors, which happened to be all women except for one man. It's all women pastors that were there. The church is run by women in Mongolia, actually for much of China too, for that matter. Nobody told them you're not supposed to ordain women, so they just kind of did it because, well, a lot of the men were in prison camps, and yeah, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Nobody said you can't do it, so they just... Yeah. Anyways, all these women are there, and so I was preaching at the church on Sabbath, the main church in the capital, and I get up ready to preach, and they say, "Take your shoes off." And I've preached in a lot of countries where you don't wear shoes coming into the sanctuary or into the building, stuff like that. So I was used to that. But in this church, everyone was wearing shoes except for me, and I'm about to go up to the pulpit. And I asked a very silly question again. I said, "Why?" And they said, "We don't know." And the Mongolian church only started in the 90s. It's a very young church. And they said, "Oh, we'll get back to you." So that next week, because they're my students, they came back to me and said, "We talked to a couple of the old timers in the founding of the church. When we bought the church, we put in brand new carpet, and we didn't want it to get soiled and dirty. So we asked the preacher, when they preach in the pulpit on Sabbath morning, to take off their shoes. But the old-timers said, the carpet looks really old and not so nice anymore, so we think maybe it's time we can start letting people preach with their shoes on again." But sometimes we develop traditions and we don't even know why we do what we're doing. Does that make sense? All right. Yeah, okay.
I just want to, first of all, thank you for the work you do and the things that you've talked about here this week, and I appreciate that. I listened carefully, I think, last night and today, this afternoon particularly. I'd like to think that I kind of pay attention both to current events but historical events, and I'm really intrigued by what I'm hearing, what I heard you talk about as being the events sort of right after Ellen White's death and the sort of rise of fundamentalism in our church.
Yeah.
And then what you talked about this afternoon, I heard you say at least one of our church leaders at least referred to us as shifting or describing us as an evangelical versus fundamentalist church. But I guess I'm not as optimistic with what I've seen in recent years in church events. As I've watched our church become very, very polarized, and I'm speaking in the worldwide sense, not necessarily here in Coeur d'Alene. I've watched our church, the Adventist church, become very, very polarized, very saturated with a lot of secular politics, and I'll say Christian nationalism being a big part of that.
Yeah.
And it even, I think fundamentalism continues to sort of show its face in a lot of different ways in our leadership. And I guess I'm putting you on the spot here, and you can feel free to decline to answer this question because it is putting you on the spot. But I mean, are you optimistic about what you see, whether we have 1 year or another 100 years on this planet? I think the latter unlikely, but whether we have 1 or 100 years here as a church on this planet before Christ comes, are you an optimist about the direction of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and why?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely, I'm an optimist, and I believe in the mission of the church, and I believe God can work in and through the church. You look through all of church history, there's been fallible and foible people who've made mistakes, and there have been challenges facing the church. But God has worked in and through the church all the same. And in fact, the more I'm willing to admit that I'm foible and have faults and mistakes and that I need to grow more like Jesus, the more I'm willing to be charitable with others around me and say, you know, if God's been that patient with me, I need to be patient with others. I need to be patient with my church. I love my church. I know it has its problems, but I want to make, within my circle of influence, I want to make the church the best that it can be to point people to Christ. And so I'm optimistic because otherwise I wouldn't have spent so much time in higher education. I'm still committed to education, although I'd like to think that I'm trying to create educational resources for not just one individual classroom, but for all of our schools and churches across the division. So I am optimistic. I'm especially, you know, I work at the North American Division, and what I really admire is I think we have some of the best church leaders in the denomination that are working in church leadership, asking tough questions, saying how can we help grow healthy churches in a Christ-centered approach to Adventism that I just really admire and appreciate. So I'm excited to be and see that I think in North America, I know we have challenges in North America, but I also see challenges come as opportunities. So I don't know how much time we'll have, but I do believe God calls us to be faithful, and we have, so let's be faithful. Whatever time we do have to use and exert our influence to the glory of God, and whether it's this church here in northern Idaho or back Maryland at home, let's use our influence for the kingdom of God. Let's point people to Jesus, so that, and I think that's the most contagious way of Adventism is when we can share our faith in a way that others see and say, you know, you have something that I need, something that I want. And when we do that, that's the most effective form of evangelism that we can possibly ever have. And so, yeah, I am hopeful. But my focus isn't on the problems of the church. I'm very cognizant of the problems too, and I've seen some of those challenges, and you know, I've been hurt by certain things that have happened in the church too. But an old mentor of mine, he said, you know, Michael, you have one of two ways of dealing with that. You can allow those things and challenges and problems to allow you to become bitter and push you away. Or you can say, as you have a sphere of influence and opportunity, when you're placed in the same circumstances, will you choose to do the right thing that others have not done? So let's choose to exert our influence to the kingdom of God. Yeah.
Because no matter who sits in the White House, God is still...
You know, this isn't my church either, by the way. This is his church. And whatever role that we have, we're just mere custodians anyway. So when I realized that it's not my church and it's not my responsibility to fix all the problems in the church either, and that takes a weight of burden off my shoulders that I don't have to worry about that God calls me to be faithful to what I have before me right now, and that's it. Yeah. I have a couple more hands. I don't know how long you want us to go, but here we go.
Yeah, I spoke with you briefly in the lobby about, we've talked a lot about Ellen White today, and,
Yeah.
it says in Revelation that the remnant church will have the spirit of prophecy.
Yeah.
It doesn't say the remnant church will have a prophet. And I just wonder if, first of all, maybe, let me get your opinion, would it be good to maybe do a little bit more in terms of recognizing some of the other prophets that, some of the other people that had visions? I'm thinking specifically of William Miller. He had the jewel box vision, which Ellen White seems to endorse.
Well, I don't think he ever considered it a vision. It was a dream.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
and then also Loughborough, was it, who the day after the disappointment saw, was it maybe a vision or something about...
He called it a dream too.
A dream as well about Christ moving into the most holy place?
Yeah. Oh, you're talking about Hiram Edson.
Yeah, Hiram
Yeah, he
Edson.
never said that was a vision, but he said that I should get my lecture out. I actually have his exact words, but that it was like vividly impressed upon him. So I don't know what that is, whether that was a vision or God just impressing his mind or what. But yeah, you make a good point that, and I don't think the Seventh-day Adventist Church has ever said that we only have a prophet. The spirit of prophecy means God can work. And, you look at Joel chapter 2, it talks about the gift of prophecy being not as an individual gift, but a collective gift, right? Your sons and daughters, right? So that we should expect more than just a individual. Now the question is whether a person is the genuine manifestation of the gift of prophecy versus many supposed self-appointed prophets who don't have that gift. But when I teach Adventist history and then when I have more time, you realize I'm a teacher. So I could go all week because I have this stuff. I love teaching this stuff. But yeah, I have a whole lecture that I give on just William Foy and Hazen Foss, for example. So there were other people that had manifestations. We also recognize in the mission field experience, as Adventist missionaries have gone to different places where there have been supernatural phenomena that have happened. Glossolalia, the speaking in tongues, one of my favorite mission stories is how Adventist missions began in Turkey. It was a man who actually came to California, spent 30 years trying to get a visa. Eventually gets to California, is doing very well, has a great career, and he sees the circus is coming to town, big tent. So excited, he goes to the circus. He thinks. Turns out it's an Adventist evangelistic meeting, and he hears them preaching in Turkish every night. Gets to the end of the meetings, and there's an appeal, and he gives his heart to Christ, comes up and tries to talk to them in Turkish, and he's like, why aren't you talking to me in Turkish? Because you've been preaching to me in Turkish. And they said, we can't speak Turkish. You know what? He was our first Adventist convert, and he fell in love with Jesus and the Adventist message. There's no other way to describe this than glossolalia in terms of the speaking, what we call the speaking of tongues, the intelligible speaking of tongues, that this had to have happened, and he goes back to his home country. So we know in the early Adventist pioneers, with the earliest days, that there were manifestations of the gift of tongues, the gift of prophecy, different kinds of things. Now the question is will God manifest that gift in another person before he comes? I don't have a good answer for you. I would probably put this out there, and that is if we don't take the prophet or the prophetic gift seriously that we already have, why would God send another prophetic messenger? That's just my little thing there. We like to talk about Ellen White, but do we actually really take her seriously and really read her writings? Not so much.
Well, on that point, I have kind of a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Is there a good resource you can recommend where it would, maybe in a historical context, outline all the prophecies that Ellen White has had and maybe give a little bit of context around them?
That's
because
a
she
good
had a
question.
number of visions, and a number of them were public as well, but then
Yeah.
some of them were private. Has there ever been like a cataloging of all of those done by the White Estate? Or
Yeah, I don't
like
know that anyone's ever cataloged them. I know there's a couple, maybe about a couple dozen of frequent examples that are well known. Ellen White was really not the kind of person that did a lot of like foretelling, like, if you don't do this, there's going to be a lightning bolt from heaven and you're going to get struck down or whatever. She really doesn't do a lot of predicting kind of stuff. But there are certainly a few examples that do exist, and I think the most famous ones, someone asked about Arthur White's biography. That was like a really big question that Arthur White was concerned about, and the most well-known examples of that, and here I'll actually find myself recommending those 6 volumes, Arthur White's 6-volume biography. That was something that he spent a lot of time on. He was very concerned about, and you can find some examples, probably the best examples, looking through his Arthur White's biography of Ellen White. So there you go. Yeah, hopefully that's helpful. Yeah. Okay. Great questions, everyone. Thank you.
About a year and a half ago, Randy Roberts, confined in his office on Sabbath mornings because of COVID,
Yeah.
preached a sermon on why I'm a Seventh-day Adventist.
Sure.
And he prefaced his remarks by saying that he believed that there were a lot of Seventh-day Adventists who, if asked why they were a Seventh-day Adventist, would not have a definitive answer. We're different. And I'm assuming there is something unique. We're here for a purpose. In 1844, there were those cosmic events, and there were several churches that emerged out of that. And a church, an organization, assembles itself because they think they have something to give that nobody else has. They have something to offer. What is that? And the reason I pose this is that I think certainly an exploration of Adventist history would have possibly some answers, or maybe the answer to that. So now I guess I've really put you on the spot here. In the last 40 years, we have had a re-emphasis in 1888. There's been a real emphasis in righteousness by faith, for example.
Yeah.
That would be my perception. That couldn't be the reason why we were formulated in 1860 or whatever. There were other people preaching that. Certainly the Baptists would say that's our mantra, and certainly the Lutherans with Martin Luther would say, hey, that's our guy. So to say it's righteousness by faith, that no one had that message, that would be, that's pretty straining things a little bit.
So your question's centered on 1888 then, or what?
Well,
You're getting there?
I'm just,
Okay.
yeah, okay. That's a significant message, but there's other people preaching that. The world doesn't need us to preach that because there are other people preaching that. There are other people who are preaching Jesus is coming. Certainly, in modern times, there are a lot of people who are preaching the second advent. I was surprised to see a video of, I'm going to guess it was a Pentecostal preacher, telling his congregation that the lamb-like beast after studying and looking at the evidence, the lamb-like beast is the United States. Now, I mean, that's our baby. Other people aren't supposed to be preaching that. There are other people that keep the Sabbath, certainly the Jews. We got it from Seventh-day Baptists. There are some Muslims who are Sabbath keepers. Our pastor just reported over in Rathdrum, they found this tiny little group of Sabbath keepers over there. So if the Sabbath isn't, if the world has the Sabbath, there's other people preaching that. There's other people preaching righteousness by faith. There's other people preaching Jesus is coming.
Yeah.
What is it? What am I here for?
Yeah.
What are we here? What is the church for? You said you enjoy participating in the mission, and that's a big thing.
Yeah.
But what is my distinctive thing? And if I don't know that, if like Randy Roberts said, he thinks they're, what am I supposed to be doing? And if I don't know, is it not getting done?
Well, I can't profess to speak for Randy. He's a friend of mine, and so I don't know what context he was saying that, but or what he was trying to say. But what I will say is that I think our prophetic mission, history, and identity, as I mentioned in my sermon this morning, are found in Revelation 10, 12, and 14. And I would say our history is described there. No other church I know of finds its history described in Revelation 10. The scroll that is eaten is sweet and then becomes bitter, describing the Advent experience. Revelation 12, which identifies God's people as having the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus. And we're the only church, although you're right, there are other denominations like Seventh-day Baptists that keep the Sabbath, and there are other denominations that claim to have the prophetic gift. Think of the Mormons. But no church that I know of claims to have both of those characteristics together. And finds that as part of their unique identity. And then finally, the mission, in terms of Revelation chapter 14, right? The three angels' messages that God's given us a work to do. Now, I would say with 1888, there are other churches that teach righteousness by faith, but our problem is with Adventism, we focused on all of these unique doctrinal ideas to the exclusion of Christ being at the center of them. And our problem is that we needed to keep Christ at the center of all of our unique doctrinal beliefs. And if we ever keep Christ out of the Sabbath and the second coming and those other kinds of things, we actually become theologically unbalanced. And the message of 1888 is theological balance, that Christ is at the heart and always needs to remain at the heart and center of Adventist theology. One last quick thing is every Reform group in the last 100 years that has claimed to reform the Seventh-day Adventist Church has used 1888 as its mantra. Its reason for reforming the church, and they have the true or secret knowledge that will somehow save or reform Adventism. A good example of this is David Koresh. When I was down in Texas, if you go to the compound, there's actually some Branch Davidians there today. They've rebuilt the compound that's there, and there's a big, huge statue out front, memorial to Wagner and Jones as the inspiration for their movement. I've actually written a paper where I argue that every reform group in Adventist history has in one way, shape, or form or another, has claimed to have the true knowledge of 1888. I don't think 1888 was a secret kind of knowledge, secret kind of reform thing. I think it really just came down to what Ellen White said, is that we preached the law, till we were as spiritually dry as the hills of Gilboa. We needed Christ at the center of our Adventist experience. Do other people teach it? Yes. Problem is we had forgotten it, and we needed to be reminded that we needed righteousness by faith. We needed Christ's righteousness, and we needed to have that Christ-centered approach in Adventism. That's probably a little overly simplistic, but at its most basic level, that's how I see and understand 1888. Our mission isn't that we have some unique doctrine that no one else is teaching. What makes Adventism so exciting to me is all of these things together are an integrated package that reveal the character of God and what a loving God we have at the very end of time, the most clear depiction of the character of God. We see that through the Sabbath. We see that He's coming again. We see that through the sanctuary. We see a loving Savior, and God's people at the end of time will have the clearest understanding of the character of God and share that with the world that so desperately wants to hear that news, and that those will listen will just be utterly transformed, and that will be just just amazing. And what a great privilege that will be for us to be able to share that understanding with others. And that's why I'm excited to be a Seventh-day Adventist. Yeah.